Appreciate everyone being here this evening. If you'll turn your Bibles to the book of Numbers, the introductory lesson is out there. We're going to spend a couple of weeks on that so we can kind of get a view of the whole book, and then maybe we won't have to spend a lot of detailed time as we go through the book. But I wanted to get an idea of where we're at on our mindset of where this book fits in as far as our Bible is concerned. And I think this first paragraph or sentence is something I think is very helpful. We know about Genesis, then about Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Let's look how Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers go together while we have it maybe the order that we do. And as I was saying, after the law of Moses was given on Mount Sinai, and the tabernacle was erected in the book of Exodus. So after that event takes place, and you'll read, if you read to Exodus, the 40th chapter, in verse 17, we're looking at 2 years after they came out of Egyptian bondage. In the first month of the second year, they erected the tabernacle. Forget about Leviticus for a moment. But I'm going to say the month of instruction regarding acceptable sacrifices was established in the book of Leviticus. That's how long that book took for people to go through that. But what we piece together here is that the journey to the promised land is what Numbers is going to be dealing with, was ahead of them and documented in the book of Numbers. What does the first verse of Numbers 1 speak about? Well, of the time frame that we're looking at. We're in the second year. We're in the second month. First month, Exodus. The temple is erected. Now it's going to be taken down and as a journey toward the land of Canaan. And that's the book of Numbers. And we're just going to be first half of the book. It won't take long as far as days are concerned that we have there. But you'll see, well, how come in Numbers 14 we're going to be having a point that God's going to demand that that generation will not be able to enter the land, and how many years they're going to wander in the wilderness? 40. They only do 38, plus the 2 years that they've come out of Exodus. So all that would be 40 years of wandering. What's interesting, the Bible's going to tell us from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea was an 11-day trip. It took them 38 years. What happened? Disobedience to God. You could do it in 11 days. And then they wandered from what God said to be through the wilderness, and then we see the narratives taking place during that particular time. So the time frame is established by Scripture that indeed after Exodus, you're looking at the next, a month goes by, and then the second month, Leviticus is that first month of all the sacrifices, and the tabernacle is erected, and now it's getting ready to be torn down and traveling. They're going to be traveling with that, with all those things, and we have the book of Numbers speaking about that. So that's a time frame I think is helpful to me. That's why Exodus, Leviticus, 1 month. Exodus, so I got the tabernacle erected. Now we're going to be leaving Mount Sinai and go up to Kadesh Barnea, about 11 days trip. And on the way, we find that their lack of faith, their lack of trusting God deterred that. And then we see the rest of the book of Numbers, what was the consequences of that. So let's look at the title of the book. The Hebrew Scriptures. One of the things you'll notice in, like for Numbers 1:1, Jehovah, he spake unto Moses where? They're in the wilderness of Sinai. They had the law given, Exodus 20. They're in the wilderness or the desert area. Not a lot of people there. Doesn't mean there wasn't any grass, but desert area for the. He's there. That's where it is. In most of the Hebrew Scriptures, you'll get the name of the title of the book in the first verse. And this Hebrew word means in the wilderness. You establish it in the very first verse. Our book of Numbers in the Hebrew Scriptures is in the wilderness or in the desert. That's a meaningful phrase for the book in the very first book. First verse. They're going to be traveling. They're in the wilderness. They're going to be traveling, and they're going to travel a lot further in the wilderness than they were originally going to have to do. They're on their way to the land of Canaan. And I just want you to think about, we know in Numbers, the 14th chapter, the lack of faith that they had with God and the promised land. Have you ever anticipated a journey? Usually going on vacation time, you really look forward to that journey, don't you? You're planning for that. They're all geared up to go. And the promised land is just over there. And we're at Mount Sinai now. We've had the law, and now we're getting ready to pack up, and we're going 11-day journey to Kadesh Barnea. And events change. It became the worst journey that they had. One generation is going to die, going to be wiped out by God's command. That particular generation that should have had the strength of faith to serve God, those 20 and under, that's a new generation. And I want you to be prepared. The book of Numbers speaks to the first generation, and it speaks to the second generation. In the middle is the wandering of the 38 years. Sometimes we look at the book of Numbers, and what are you seeing? They're taking a census. They're going to take a census. They're only going to take 2. They'll take a census of the Levites. They'll take 2 primary censuses, and you figure out why. Maybe first generation in the wandering in the wilderness, that second generation is out. I need to take another census. And why do they take a census anyway? He's going to tell you. And we'll learn that in the book of Numbers. But the title of it is in the wilderness, in the desert. Now, you come to the Greek. What word do you see there in the Greek that we have an English word from, that we get it from? We get arithmetic. We do that with numbers, don't you? But the Greek term, that you got to realize that around 250 BC, middle of the 3rd century, some have 285, 275. Let's just say 250 to be in the middle of that century. Is that you have the Greek people, they wanted the Jewish language in their language. So you had the Jews there, and they were learning Greek. That was a common language of the world at that time. And they wanted to have their Hebrew scriptures translated into the Greek. And so what they did, the Septuagint, that's when you see the LXX, is that's what it was. It was where we get our word arithmetic. Indeed, they changed that. You take that now, next step to the Latin, numeri. That was meaningful because the people, is highlighted in the book of Numbers, the idea of the taking of the 2 censuses. Notice it's the very first, and that's the end, toward the end of the book. And so this word, numbers, is being formed for us because from the Latin Vulgate, our English translations came from that. And in the English, our word numbers is how we remember this particular book. That is a meaningful thing because of the census being taken. They're going to number the Levites. They're going to be numbered. The primary ones of numbering would be the first and the second. Now, if you read Numbers or familiar with it, what do you think they numbered? David numbered the people of Israel, and it was sinful. But God commands this, and He was commanding them that would be 20 years of age and upward of those who had the ability to do what? In these first chapter, go to war. Well, we need to get a census to see how many representatives we can have in our Congress. Population. No, they want men, fighting men, who could battle in war. Why would they want that? They're going to be traveling. They're going to be meeting other people. There could be their enemies. They're going to be traveling. And they needed to know how many they have for war. And sometimes we think, well, we just want to get the number of the people. So first one, 603,000 plus. It'll be the numbers that we'll look at. And you see that's how many fighting men that they had. So what could we say might be the population of the people of Israel? They start with 70 in Egypt. We're now coming out of Egyptian bondage, and we're now into the second year out of Egyptian bondage. So there's a lot of years that have transpired of all that time. How many people do you think we're talking about, approximately? Because it's an approximation. All we know, these guys can fight wars. And I don't know if they had any 70 years old and said, hey, we're going to go fight too, or maybe just cut off at 50. I don't know what it was. They said, Caleb was an old man. He said, I'd take it. I think that's exactly right. Between at least 2 million, maybe 2.5, 3 million, maybe at the top of that, of those who were indeed able to go to war. The second census will be 601,000. 40 years, and you didn't enlarge your population of fighting men? What happened? You got a generation that died, men. And men who didn't have the courage to go into the land as they're supposed to be. You had that generation of men, and the population decreased, and that's because of that. You'd have time to had more people, but all the people that generation of those men, especially the fighting men, that generation of 20 and above, when they didn't serve God as they should, they all died out in the wilderness. So the population dwindles. But that's indicative of at least 2 million, 2.5 million people, and then that's where your skeptics come. How could they operate in the wilderness? How could they operate? How are they going to feed them, and how are they going to move when they need to move? And it's going to be interesting how God does that in the wilderness, and He will supply their needs. Manna, water from the rock. A lot of stories connected with that, but we're going to be seeing of His sustenance that He gives the people, much less that they would have the opportunity to dwell through the land and do what they can. And the fighting men are going to be important, because there's going to be a whole chapter where God commands the people of Israel to kill the Midianites. That's a war with Midian. Wipe them out. And the reason I know He wanted to wipe them out is that when they did fight the battle, they were involved in winning it pretty easily, but they left the women alive. And I was upset. You're supposed to wipe them out. Well, we're going to talk to Jehovah about that. Jehovah said, kill all the wives. Now, skeptics don't like a God like that. But think in terms of retributive type of a war. We don't have a problem with God using Nebuchadnezzar and the Chaldeans to take Israel. I mean, we've got a prophet that did, but he had to learn that God uses nations to take out nations. He's getting ready to establish a nation in the land of Canaan, and He's going to have them take over that. But in between time, there's this great battle, and it's just going to be interesting to see how easy the battle was, how much of the booty they got, the idea of all the treasures they had is enormous, and they didn't lose one man in fighting the war. Not one. Took care of all the kings, the Midianites, took care of their armies, had an easy battle, about 1 or 2 verses about all you have. And I'm saying, look at that, if that's not a picture of God's fingerprint. And the point is that it was time for Midian to be facing the consequences of how they brought in idolatry to the people, all of the ungodliness there. He had given them time to exist. He wants them wiped out. And that's exactly what takes place. So we'll look at the at the context of those things. Well, but it is indeed tough, because you got women after they kept them and they kept them alive, and they would come in and have to kill them too. But he said, I'm Jehovah. And that was what he's doing. But he could be righteous in doing all that because it was time to repay them. But here we have the numbering for a purpose. And sometimes I think of numbers, I say, well, that's going to be tough reading, because I don't have to read about all the different, how they number it, says same thing, same thing, same thing. It's a lot of narrative in Numbers. And we'll see how the structure comes. The theme of the book. It's not original to me. It's got Paul speaking about it. But as far as making this theme of the book, I found this, and I think it's very good. And things lay out for it. Behold the goodness and severity of God. And when we think about God's goodness, especially in the context of the journey to Canaan, so we're looking at this, what is the first part of this, the book, through chapter 14, you've got them, making plans to go and all of those things, and then they've been wandering in the wilderness for a year, and events that would transpire, and then what would transpire with them finally getting into the land of Canaan. God's goodness was there, and I just say, here's the manna, that's the bread. Now, did the people of Israel get tired of the bread? They did, but Exodus 16:31, it tasted like honey. It was a wafer that tasted like honey. It was white as the coriander seed. And you have a picture of that. But it was also a gum-like substance. And it's like a pearl white. The bedlam would be a kind of a pearl white. And so Numbers speaks about that in chapter 11, 7 through 9. It was like the color of that. Well, could be a pearl white color, and that would kind of be the white of the coriander seed, and that was a plant, an herb that was setting forth. But anyway, that's what God provided that for them, and they were able to pick that up. They were daily sustenance, and as we see from the passage on preparing for the Sabbath day, they would get twice as much. Those who had need. But there was the water for the people, and it has helped. It took care of the thirsty animals too, all their flock, all their things. So we come to Numbers 20 for that. And what do you remember about that regarding Moses? At this occasion, we're not in the first part of the wilderness wanderings. We're now dealing with their on their way. They have to wander in the wilderness to get to the promised land again. But we'll find out how did Moses interact on this one? Was it a pretty bad thing for him? Yeah, he lost his temper, and he struck the rock when he's supposed to speak to it, and he didn't sanctify God in the eyes of the people, but they got water. But the severity of God was there as well. And we could talk more about his goodness, but I just want to give us a sampling that as per journey, we're in the wilderness going on a journey. We've had the numbers, so we're going to fight wars in the journey. And the theme here is God's goodness. And then this is his severity. And one of the main ones is that the judgment against unbelief. A generation would not enter into the promised land. And that's part of his severity. Aaron would not enter into the land. Moses would not enter into the land. They didn't sanctify God before their eyes. God can wipe out a whole nation, including the women, and severity of ungodliness. And his time for that to end. And so we could have a lot of severity, but there was a lot of goodness. We'll be introduced to the cloud, and we've taken it out of Exodus, coming out of there and leaving there's a cloud and fire by night to guide them and so forth to take care of overcoming Pharaoh. But the cloud is going to be a very interesting part here of, I think, and I could put that with God's goodness. that the cloud will become fire by night. It's a cloud. And when it moved, that's when God's people moved. And when it stood still over the tabernacle, they didn't move. What a passage for authority for what we do. They don't make a move till God moves. And that's the way we're supposed to look at Scripture. Where's your authority for what you do? I think God would like this. And they realized they could not do that. That God's glory was seen in that cloud, and it would be over the tabernacle and filling it. And this will be as they journey through to the promised land, and the cloud would move. It's time to go. I don't do anything except God directs me. And that's the move. And that's a wonderful chapter for a sermon on authority, that God has always wanted people to go by his authority. And the cloud was doing that. It wasn't just there with Egypt and Pharaoh problems. It was there when they were wondering. God's goodness, he gives guidance, not only manna and water for sustenance. He gives spiritual guidance. But the severity of it is when their lack of faith. We look like grasshoppers in front of all those giants. And Caleb and Joshua said, we can take them. God's on our side. But they went the other way, and God punishes them. The severity. So when we look at the New Testament, come with me to 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, in 5 through 12, we have all of these examples of idolatry, the idea of the brazen serpent, and all of those things of connected with idolatry that we're looking at. And he said, these things happen unto them. He says, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth. We're Israel. We're God's people. Notice they were baptized in the cloud. They're baptized in the cloud, baptized into Moses. Moses' authority, cloud. What does that mean now? Well, you've studied Numbers, you know exactly what it means. I got immersed in the cloud. Yeah, I was following the cloud wherever it led. And we didn't make a move, and Moses is in charge. And yet they, the very people of God, were not going to be entered into that promised land. And here's all the things that they did. These things happened by, what does your Bible say? Does it say example or ensample? And a lot of you have translations, you would know the difference. But if you have American Standard, it will say ensample. It's not example. It is etched in stone. And he's writing this to the Corinthians. It's something that is anti-type, that type of permanency. This stands there as rock solid, that indeed God's people will be dealt with severely by God if they go into unbelief. But you'll find, as you look at your footnotes, you'll find a lot of those events there are going to be happening in the book of Numbers. And the point from that, the New Testament references Numbers. That's why it's important to study the book. And it's what we take away from this, the goodness, severity of God, yes, but from the New Testament point of view, let him that thinketh he standeth. I'm a Christian, or I'm a Jew in the Old Testament. I'm a Christian. Nothing's going to happen to me. You better take heed lest you fall. These are written for our benefit. It's an ensample unto us who are Christians in Corinth. And it's an example to us who are Christians at Parkview as well. Book of Numbers is that important to study. The New Testament has it that way. And then the New Testament also refers to the events of Numbers. From Hebrews, the 3rd chapter, and verse 15. And you may be more familiar with that, but you start with the latter part of chapter 3, and you come into Hebrews, the 4th chapter, and you realize that they didn't enter in because of unbelief, and they said a disobedience. They didn't believe it, so they disobeyed God in taking the land. He said, they're not going to have the Sabbath rest. They're not going to enjoy the rest. And it goes into the 4th chapter and gives forth teachings of prophecy by David about the people of God, that they were not going to enter in God's rest. And the point is, we see that they were not able to enter in because of unbelief. Unbelief will lead to disobedience, and both of them will send you to hell. That's what it, but I didn't believe God to have the courage to obey his commands. And there's a generation that didn't enter in. Hebrew writer refers back to the book of Numbers for that event that takes place, and we'll see that unfold as we look at the narrative of our book. Any questions on the theme of the book? It's a journey gone bad, but it went bad because they weren't prepared to continue to obey God, and their lack of faith, their disobedience, leads to their demise. And but the book of Numbers says, all right, that's part of this, but now we got a new generation. Those who were babies, those who are under 20, they're coming along, and we're going to number them as we prepare them for the land of Canaan. I want to look at the structure of the book. This, I think, is very helpful to look at the structure. You can divide Numbers into kind of 3 sections. I want us to see that. There's first the old generation. We're talking here about we're at Sinai. We received the law. We've erected the tabernacle. Bit of month on dealing with the book of Leviticus. And now it's time to move. And where are we moving to? We're moving up to Kadesh. You'll find in the book of Numbers, that was an 11-day journey. And so what happens in that, you have the numbering, chapters 1 through 4. What's the purpose of the numbering? For war is going to take place. We want men fighting age, 20 years old, what the Bible says, that they were going to use, 20 years old and upward. And then chapters 5 through 9, you have instructions. So we're just not numbering, but we're saying, well, we're prepared for war. Now I need to prepare the people, especially things that are going to be involved upon the journey. Like you're going to be setting up camps. What if someone has leprosy? What if someone has touched a dead body? Well, they got some instruction about that. Wonder if you're jealous because you think your wife cheated on you. Well, we'll have a drink for her. She'll be drinking some bitter water, and God will tell you if she's been faithful or not. If she's not been faithful, she'll die. We got that in the book of Numbers. And all of the instructions, there'll be instructions for the Levites and for Aaron and his sons. You know, I've been preaching for quite a while. I didn't go to school to learn how to preach, but trying to study my Bible. And there was a time when I didn't distinguish between the Levites and the priest. That just passed over me. I never did that. I think there was a kind sister here. She's dead. I know that, and she passed away quite a while long ago. But she taught me more perfectly. Okay, I didn't like the way she did it, but she did it. I learned. But I learned that in Book of Numbers. This makes it pretty clear. I had to study Numbers. I wasn't even studying Leviticus very well, but I realized there was quite a difference. Levites there were to help the priest in numbering them. We say in assisting them in their work, and that but Aaron and his sons would be the high priesthood. That seems so simple, but there's a time when I didn't grasp that, and I just remind myself. Then, if you just study the scriptures, you'll find out just how off you were. But there's instruction for all of those in these chapters, and then the journey. All the stuff they prepared. You'll see that Aaron and his sons, they were doing the covering of all that veil between the holy place and the holy place. They would take that veil and cover it. They would cover that and do it with sealskin. Kind of be water retardant that way. And then they would cover the Ark of the Covenant. They would cover the Ark of the Incense, and all of the coverings will be there. And then you'd have the Levites come in. They could not just come into the sanctuary. They had to be accompanied by a priest, which would be Aaron and his sons. And they were not to look upon that. It's all covered. But the Kohathites will be taking that Ark of the Covenant out. And they all have their specific job. It's all preparing for a journey. And it was going to go bad. And what happens in chapter 14? It goes bad for them. And we know why that happens. So that's the old generation. That's the first 14 chapters of Numbers. There's a transition era in the wilderness. That generation is going to die out. And from chapters 15 to 20, you'll have the wandering, but you have the sons of Korah rebelling. You've got Aaron and Miriam rebelling against Moses. And you'll see those stories. That's the transition era of a generation going to die and a new generation coming on the scene. That takes care of those 6 chapters there. So we're into the 20th chapter, and that's where the water comes from. Moses is now, and Aaron, they're not going to be able to go in the land of Canaan, and there's going to be a chapter on the successor of Moses, and that's going to be taking place. And then the third section is the new generation, and that's Kadesh to Moab. Moab, Mount Pisgah, look at over there, you'll see the promised land. Now notice what happened. They have a new journey. The new journey in chapters 21 through 25. You're going to be dealing with Balaam, false prophet, as they travel. The new numbering, why? Because their generation has been replaced. How many we have now? 20 years old, upward, they are capable of war. And new instructions that are taking place. And so you have law being given, instruction being given, connected with the journeying that they're making. And you have 2 generations, you got 2 countings, two senses, you got 2 instruction sections. Got a lot of 2s there that can say, well, I'm in the first part was instruction, I got in the latter part instruction, I got new journeying taking place, new numbering taking place. That's how the book is structured, I think, very well. And you'll find they're not in chronological order, but it's subject matter, just like we've been studying the book of Ezekiel. So does that help you with the book of Numbers to realize what you're in for? You're going to be a lot of numbering taking place the first, then got instruction, and now you got the journey. And it's going to be developed those three ways. Any questions or comments you'd like to make? Okay. Let me see if I pass through the. I didn't put the structure. I didn't put the author there, but let's. Who is the author of the book? Anybody? You like Moses? Look at Numbers 33 and verse 2. And you'll find that he would write down the history. So I think he very well could be involved in writing down the events that took place. He's going to be speaking to the people. He's not dead yet, but he wouldn't enter into the land of Canaan. So Numbers 20, and he's picking a successor that's taking place. All of that's occurring. So I think he could have written that, keeping a record of things. He talks about the death of Aaron. He's be present for that. But he's receiving instructions. What does that verse say about him writing down the events of that? Left my glasses at home, don't have any contacts in, I'm blind as a bat. So tell me, somebody read it for me.
Moses wrote their goings out according to their journeys, the commandment of Jehovah. These are the journeys according to their going out.
Okay, as they're going out and departing, he took a record of all those things. So I think he could be very one that does that. A lot of times, what about Deuteronomy? Probably there'll be someone that would finish off the book, that they would come in and finish it, dealing with Moses' life, and here's a section about Moses they could put in there. But he was writing, and people used to say, well, there wasn't any writing, write the Pentateuch. Well, Pentateuch, it's, here's the books, the 5 books of the law. And but they realized there was writing at that time, and Moses was writing things down as God commanded him to do. And So I think he's a primary author. It would be, I think he did all of it, but he would be the one, and there's not anyone better than that to set forth on that. So let's look a little bit about the census. 603,550. And so they took a census, 20 years old and above, of those who are involved in having the ability to go to war. And so you look at Ephraim. Was Ephraim, they had more fighting men than Manasseh? There's the two tribes of Joseph that we see there. Thank you. So they would have more, 40,500, Manasseh 32,2. It's going to be reversed. It's interesting. It's going to be reversed at the end of the new generation, that Manasseh will have more than Ephraim. But you have that, and it ends up being 603,550, and that's a number you can remember as well. Let me continue. What's the second census going to be about? Manasseh's 52,7, and Ephraim's down to 32,5. But you have representatives of all of the tribes, but you only have 601,730, and that would be logical, even though you're having more and more people get married and so forth, time-wise, but you lost out a whole generation, especially the male population that we're fighting, and it would cover all the other people connected with them as well. You had that generation die. Now, so it would be logical you'd have less, again, because of disobedience that we have. One of the things that we're going to be observing is the distribution of the camp of Israel in these first few chapters. And it's kind of interesting. We've just studied Ezekiel, and we're looking at that temple showing the glory of God, and we don't have anything like this here. But as they travel, this is how they were to be divided as far as the camp is concerned. And God had it orderly found. You have Asher, Dan, and Naphtali on the north, but it was very important to start with the east. And we have Judah. As the sun would rise this way, it would rise this way. And you had the tabernacle, which is the tent. So you had Moses, Aaron, and his sons, and the priest. They would be connected with it, but Judah would be right in the middle. In fact, Judah, Dan, Ephraim, and Reuben are the primary standards, and each side of them are people connected with them. And Issachar and Zebulun. And then with Reuben, you have Gad and Simeon. Ephraim, you have Benjamin and Manasseh. That's the west. And the north, you have Dan. We have Asher and Naphtali. The Merarites, the Gershonites, and the Kohathites, they were indeed of the Levites. And those are those brethren. And they would be there around the tabernacle. Again, they're assisting the priest. They're distinguished between the two. So here's a problem. If you got 2.5 million people, and I think that's what you had. This is all the people. That's how they're camping. And you have the standard bearers, Judah, Dan, Ephraim, and Reuben. And you have that many people. People say, well, how, by the time you got each standard bearer and you got them on the march and leaving, then you have another one going, then you have another one going, and all that, and the tabernacle, all that, you would have something 21 miles long. You know, it'd be something that you're waiting, and you couldn't do that orderly in a day's of traveling. Couldn't do that. And they've looked at it, well, just a long. I wonder if you had, because you'll read about the trumpets. See, the trumpets were there, and they were to sound when it's time to move. There would be a trumpet of alarm that would be set forth. There'd be a trumpet to call the people, and sometimes it would be 2 sounds to call just the priest. And so the trumpets were very important. And so you blow the first trumpet, and you have Judah and them leaving. And right after them, you had the others leaving. And they may take, it's talk about just going 10 hours. They could be leaving at the same time under their barriers. And you just started, but it doesn't mean the others couldn't start from the west and the north. They could be dividing up, and they could be going along. And then a lot of times you would follow your standards for when you camp that night, but you could be dealing with all the other people. But they're transferring, they're going out. You could have done that in 10 hours and be able to go 10 miles, for example, and travel 10 miles and set up camp before the end of the day. Now you may be setting up camp, and the last group will be setting it up at being there at 10 o'clock at night. But God was guiding them with fire at night, cloud in the daytime. And so it's not an impossibility of making that traveling. They had it orderly set up who would go first. But he's only saying that's going first. And then the others would come with him from the south, and then the west and the north. But they could be going as well. And they had plenty of wilderness to go through. But it's just interesting how the skeptics wanted to make it impossible that indeed that could happen. But that's how their camps were set up. It's interesting, the tabernacle, all of those Levites in carrying it, some would be taking care of the boards, the outward components, and some would be taking care of the furniture that's been covered up, and they would be carrying that. They had their work to be done, organized. God is an orderly God. He wanted that for his people as well. So we're going to study some more details before we get into the actual details of the book. But I want to set that before us and thought that'd be helpful. Thank you for being here.